most recent information on the human rights crisis in the country, and also very important for me particularly to share with you our campaign on claiming the freedom of political prisoners in Nicaragua, and particularly of 14 women political prisoners in this month of March, which is very important for women's struggles. I always start with the basics because Nicaragua, it's a maybe faraway country for you. So Nicaragua, it's in Central America. We are a 6 million people country. And I just wanted to show you briefly our flag, which is here, put backwards because of a sign of protest against the human rights violations that are happening in our country. And just to give you an idea on the geography of the country, but also some of the endangered species that exist in our country and that also are in danger because of some of the activities that I'm going to share with you are happening inside Nicaragua. Then I also thought that it would be important for you to see a little bit the ecosystems of Central America, so that what I'm going to explain afterwards makes some sense on what you are watching in this small image. First, well, the part that it's in green, it's currently forest in Nicaragua, and the other part that it's beige, it's agricultural systems. So you can see this huge struggle we are having in terms of keeping the forest and the protected areas in all Central America. And we call all that green part that it's connected from Panama, well, Colombia, Panama, until Mexico, the Mesoamerican biological corridor, because it plays the role of connecting biodiversity between North America and South America. And so I wanted to start sharing this information because for the past years, Nicaragua has seen an explosion in terms of the amount of gold mining concessions, and in a level that it has become the main export product of the country, which you see in the first image. It's gold, then it's coffee. I put meat, but I thought it's beef, right? The right word. Sorry, some words you have to stick with me, but I meant beef and sugarcane production. And even though gold, it's like the main export product in the country, it only gives work to less than 1% of the formal working population in the country. And this is a map. This is a map of the mining concessions in Nicaragua. I wanted first to show you the kind of species that exist, some of the pictures of our big and most important water resource, which is Lake Cocibolca, which was in the first picture I show you, and which is also, in fact, the most important water reserve of all Central America, and then present you how this is being managed in the country. So basically the parts that are in green are still protected areas in Nicaragua, but as you can see from all the other colors around it, those are mining concessions in different levels. Some are operating concessions, some are being negotiated, and some is part of the land that's being offered to mining companies. So basically you can see that all the development around the protected areas, which in many cases are indigenous communities' land. And this, I think, just quite briefly can show you the picture of what's happening in Nicaragua. And I thought this was kind of interesting because I was looking to give you some information on the amount of land that is really being offered for mining concessions. And it's interesting that the institution in the state that is promoting this kind of investment says that currently Nicaragua has this amount of land that it's available for mining concession, and they use as a reference that it's a little bit more than the territory of Ireland. So basically, that's the amount of land, Nicaragua's land, that is being offered to international mining companies, which is In other words, 60% of Nicaragua's land. So basically, the past 10, 15 years, the country has been given for sale to international mining companies. Of course, this has not happened without resistance. There is different against mining social movements in different communities of Nicaragua. In some territories, and the few where they have managed to be strong enough to force the government not to give this land in a concession for the mining companies. But in most of the cases, as you can imagine, and as it happens worldwide, they are being heavily repressed by the police. And in most of the cases, unable to stop the concession because we don't have a legal system or regime in Nicaragua that considers consultation as part of the necessary requirements before giving the land concessions for mining. I also wanted to share this image because also I find that people feel, well, this is too far away, but this is not far away from the UK in terms that this is the UK ambassador just in November last year visiting one of the big mining concessions, and this was put in by the government in public media as a huge achievement and huge political support for the mining concession from a UK-based company called Condor Gold, which is one of the main companies that is actually doing this mining process in Nicaragua. And there are several reports, and I just wanted to put one of them next to this news, which is by the Auckland Institute, where they give all the detailed information on each of the companies, where they are located, and so it's important in case you want to look a little bit more on the mining concessions in Nicaragua. And the other thing I wanted to share is about the Interoceanic Canal concession. This is a concession that was given by the current regime in power, which is Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo as president and vice president, and the promoter of investments, it's their son, which is right next to them. So this canal concession was given to a Chinese private investor in 2013, and the project was sold publicly as the project that would help Nicaragua overcome poverty, because Nicaragua is really the second poorest country in the continent after Haiti. And what they presented publicly is that they were going to build up a water canal, which would be twice the size of the Panama Canal. And you can imagine, because of the pictures I show you and the very brief information I gave you, the impact that would have in our main water resource, in the protected areas, and also all the indigenous communities and rural communities that lived in this part of the country. And particularly in the areas that are supposed to be affected by the project, we are estimating around 119,000 people living in those areas, which would have to be displaced and also expropriated from their land for the project to be built. Once again, this did not happen without resistance. So a very strong rural movement emerged after this concession. This is, in Nicaragua, it's normally called Movimiento Campesino Anti-Canal, which is rural peasants movement against the canal. Which also it's joint efforts with Afro-descendant and indigenous communities that are in the part of the Caribbean of Nicaragua. So more than 100 public protests happen in their communities, but also trying to reach the capital to let the regime know that there was no support from local population to get the project moving forward. Basically, the canal concession and the law that backs it up was approved without any consultation with the communities and not even having the free, prior, and informed consent. As you know, it's an legal international obligation for this kind of project. So basically, it was negotiated privately, and we only found out about it once it was approved by Parliament, which is a parliament fully controlled by Ortega's regime. The canal concession, just to tell you something about, because of what I'm going to show you about the recent protests in the country, but also all the effort of the different sectors that joined their voice against the canal. Until now, it has not been built. The concession, legally speaking, is still there. The investor has rights for 100 years over that mega project and the possibility to expel population from those lands in a period of 100 years. So what I wanted to show you now, it's some basic information on the situation of environmental defenders and human rights defenders, not according to me, but according to some reports prepared by Frontline Defenders and also for Global Witness. So Global Witness released their report about last year events, where they documented that worldwide more than 227 land and environmental activists were murdered. And unfortunately, in Nicaragua is the country where with the highest per capita number of environmentalists murdered in the country. It means in terms of the population is the biggest one, but of course in terms of net numbers, it's Colombia, right? Colombia, then Mexico, and so on. But unfortunately, it's Nicaragua and other Central American countries like Honduras and Guatemala are part of the countries worldwide where most defenders, and this includes all different kinds, indigenous leaders, rural leaders, women, etc., are murdered. And I'm quite aware that you are familiar also with the case of Berta Cáceres, which is like the most visible case. But what happened to Berta is basically what happens in many communities in Central America, including in Nicaragua. And according to Global Witness, those killings, these are the industries that are related to those killings. So it's no wonder that mining and extractive industries is the first one. And when you hear that I'm talking about that 60% of the country is being offered for mining concessions, what that would imply in terms of the life of the people defending their lands. And just recently was released the Frontline Defenders also information. In their case, they work with a broader concept, human rights defenders. And as you can see on top of the list is always Colombia, but also Nicaragua, it's there, and Honduras, it's also there as part of the countries where more people have been killed because of their human rights or environmental work. So I wanted just to give you a few examples of the struggles in terms of environmental protection in Nicaragua, because in the anti-canal movement, in the mining concession movement, there are joint efforts, of course, the local communities, but also environmentalists, human rights defenders, independent media. There is a feminist movement also that participate. But I wanted also to give you the information on the most important events that have happened in the country and that are linked, of course, to these demands of consultation, of democracy, of considering people's opinion before putting forward these projects. And was the uprising that happened in Nicaragua in 2018. The first protest started in Nicaragua because one of our main forest reserve was burning, and there was no reaction from the state to prevent that fire from happening. And so many students that didn't manifest before publicly started going out in the streets at the same time that elderly people were starting to claim for some changes that were going to happen in the social security system that will affect them. So we had at the same moment the coincidence of two processes, the students claiming for the protection of this forest reserve, and at the same time elderly people claiming for a change in the social security legislation. And unfortunately both were heavily hit, or I don't know if it's the word, were repressed by the police. And the level of repression was completely massive in terms of protests happening in different parts, and the police started killing people, and the response of the rest of the country was starting to block streets in different parts of Nicaragua, and particularly because when the killings of students started, everything was being broadcasted through Facebook, through social media. So basically the repression that we have seen in rural communities, in indigenous communities that was like targeted to these groups now reached the city, reached the main cities, and it was openly seen by everybody. So people started reacting and protesting, no longer for the particular cause of the forest or the social security, but just claiming that the killing stopped. And what you could see, these are some of the images of what you could see, and things happening at the same time in different parts of the country, everybody doing their part in their communities, some people in massive demonstrations. The students took their universities, occupied the universities. People in rural communities stopped any transit of any vehicle. And all of that was happening because people were afraid of the groups that were sent by the government to shoot people. I'm not going to show you images of the repression, but I think it would be important if you are interested to look for the information on YouTube or on any media. But I did wanted to show you the two groups. The first is officially police operation groups, and the second one are paramilitary groups that were also organized by the political party in power, which is FSLN and the president and vice president who are there. And in the end, more than 350 people were murdered in this protest, more than 2,000 people injured, more than 1,600 arbitrary detentions happened. Currently, we have 177 political prisoners, and I'm going to share with you at the end of the event a very brief video just for you to see the faces of the women that are illegally detained at the moment and under torture conditions in Nicaragua. Hundreds of health workers were fired from their jobs because they were providing health services to the people that were injured, and the official order was not to take anyone in the hospitals of the protesters. Unfortunately, we also are seeing a refugee crisis. At the moment, there is an estimation that 150,000 Nicaraguans have left the country because of the level of repression from the regime, and the fact that it's no possibility to use the judicial system because it's completely controlled also by the regime. At the moment, none of the killing has been investigated by the police, and as you can imagine, there is no trial for any of this. On the other hand, there are illegal trials happening in this very moment against the political prisoners in Nicaragua, and they are giving them sentences of between 7 and 13 years in jail because of this. All this that I'm presenting you was well documented by the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, which is in our human rights system in the Americas, the official institution to do this kind of independent assessment. They published a report in December 2018, and they clearly stated that the regime had committed crimes against humanity. And if Nicaragua had signed the Statute of Rome, the regime could be tried for crimes against humanity. Unfortunately, and very conveniently for the Nicaraguan elites, we are not in the international criminal, we are not part of the International Criminal Court. So we will see justice only when we have a democratic transition in Nicaragua. This had led also to the historical connections, because Nicaragua is a country that lived 45 years family dictatorship from the Somozas regime since the 1930s until the triumph of the Sandinistas revolution in 1979. And currently, one of the important information I have to bring to you, this is my evaluation of the things. We are in fact, in the build-up of a second family dictatorship in Nicaragua. We have not had elections, fair elections. Last year, and with this I'm about to finish because of the time. Last year, there was a huge hope in Nicaraguan population that the regime could be changed through electoral process. There was supposed to happen presidential elections in November last year. What happened, in fact, is that the regime decided to put in jail all the 7 presidential candidates that were presented by the opposition. They decided to shut down 3 political parties that were part of the opposition. So basically, there was no possibility to vote for anyone beyond the allies of the regime. So at the moment, really, we have a parliament that is completely controlled by them. And also they have full control of the police, of the army, of the electoral system, the judiciary system. So the level of fear in Nicaragua is huge. This can only be called state terrorism. And we are in the middle of the conflict, and many members of the different organizations of the international community, between international human rights organizations, the UN High Commissioner Office, even we were just reading the statement of the EU, have all recognized that really this is a strong human rights crisis. And unfortunately, there is no clear solution on the way for us. And I would be happy to share with you later more information. But of course, this crisis, it's also linked to the importance of social movements gaining force in Nicaragua. The environmental movements started gaining a more important presence publicly through the protests, to the different actions that were made. And when these events happened, of course, all of those social movements and the people among them were criminalized. Many of the leaders of those movements are currently in jail. And of course, our claim and one of the important things we have to share with you is that there is an important struggle in the country to have a democratic transition. There is an expectation that it's through nonviolent means, and that we overcome our history of violent confrontations and civil war. But really, the regime in power is using all the tools possible to remain there, even though quite evidently, if they face a fair election, they would lose it absolutely. I just wanted to finish with this image. There is a new movement that emerged out of this massacre, which is Mothers of April Association. It gathers many of the mothers of the students that were killed and the people that were killed by the snipers of the regime and the different repression tool they use. And if you want, you can log into this Museo de la Memoria in Nicaragua, which is an effort they are doing to rebuild memory and to keep memory alive of what happened with their kids, even though we don't have currently a transition process. So I'll be happy to share with you afterwards any questions you might have, and thank you very much. Okay, so ¿dónde le doy? Aquí. Stop sharing. ¿no?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much, Monica. That was absolutely amazing. If you do have any questions, keep them in mind, and then we'll open it up to the audience at the end. And for those watching online, you can put it into the chat bar, so we will answer anything from there as well. So next, I'm going to ask James Orr to speak. So James works for Friends of the Earth here in Northern Ireland, and so he's going to share a bit about what is happening here.
Thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Brilliant. And Monica, that was just heartbreaking. And obviously, it's tried to say our total support, but that thought was just put into perspective really what is going on in other countries and the luxury in a way that we have to actually run our protests here. I'm just going to share my screen for a wee second, folks, if this works, because really what I want to do is just make some general observations about what I think might be happening in Northern Ireland and in Ireland generally. And I hope you can see that map. You know, it's called it's a terrible term, like an ecological integrity index, and it sort of puts into context a little bit about what we're doing here, why we're doing it, and also what's happened, not just over the last few decades, which has resulted in a ransacking of habitats and nature, but really what's been happening over several hundred years as well. So you'll see in that map that the deep red are the places that have suffered most from ecological collapse. And within Europe, well, first of all, Europe is the most ecologically depleted continent in the world. And you can see from that map that within Europe, Ireland, and particularly Northern Ireland and around the border, is probably, maybe apart from Malta, the most ecologically depleted part of Europe. So something has gone terribly wrong here particularly over the last few decades. And I know Fidelma will talk about mining concessions and stuff, but industrialized agriculture, you know, very poor regulation, like really an absence of regulation. I think the difference between here and Nicaragua is obviously very stark, but we have all these incredible laws, yeah, but they don't work and they don't operate. So we have the rhetoric of being like a Western country that is meant to be developing sustainably. But to me, this map really shows in in a very dark way just how far gone we are with our ecosystems. And of course, in terms of peace building and in terms of, you know, resource management and how we go forward in the future, you know, these issues are absolutely critical, not just to what we do to our fellow relatives in nature, but also how we manage ourselves going forward. So, and one of the things that strikes me is that normally it's in the periphery, normally it's in the outer regions, you know, where there's been less industrialization, for example, over the years, where you find a richness. You see it a wee bit in Scandinavia and Portugal and Northwest Spain there and Corsica, but you're not seeing it on the island of Ireland. So something dreadful has gone wrong. And there's also something about memory, you know. You mentioned that I think we're losing our memory of what is real. You know, people call it shifting baseline syndrome as well, that we forget just what these landscapes were like and how we've created what you might call storyless landscapes, you know. So I think this is ecocide, and I don't want to use that word in a very trite way, but if you look at that map, it is definitely ecocide on a basis that is so ransacking our identity and our sense of belonging and who we are, that it's no wonder that people are standing up now, and it's no wonder that, you know, within the campaigning world of Ireland generally, there are so many people who are absolutely at the point of despair. And I hope as well, you know, I just put in this quote from a guy called Joseph Horgan, who wrote a book called A Song at Your Back Door, and I lifted it the other day, and he just came up with this line, you know, it would be willful to ignore the crassness with which we have treated this magnificent island gifted to us. You know, we've been given a paradise. We don't have our trees anymore. You know, we have lost them. This image, you know, sort of demonstrates that. You know, between 30 and 40% of most European countries still have native tree cover. We have 0.04%, and our biggest illegal dump at Maboy Road in Derry, we're right beside the River Faughan, where 40% of Derry gets its water supply, has been damaged irreversibly by hospital waste, by industrial contaminants, goodness knows what else. That stands at 46 hectares, whereas our biggest, I think it's our biggest native woodland is it's pronounced Drumnyanf, forest only stands at 18.6 hectares. So something's gone terribly wrong when our illegal dumps are pale into our native woodland pales into insignificance compared to what we're doing to the natural world here. And it's been a silent spring. It's been a silent assassination on the very things that make stories and create places where people feel that they can belong. I just want to make some general points, and I know I don't have a lot of time, but I think what's happened in the last few years is that people are moving out what's been called this box of allowable activism, when we've been studying, I know Save Our Sparrows and many other groups, have been fundamental to this way of thinking, but what actually does our environmental laws regulate? We have the Habitats Directive, the EIA Directive, the Water Frameworks Directive, the Strategic Environment. We don't need any new laws, but a question has to be asked, what are they regulating? Are they regulating the environmentalists themselves because they're in this box of allowable activism, or are actually trying to stop the very things that are damaging? So if you take an incinerator, for example, some communities have been very successful, like Derry, it pops up somewhere else, a giant pig factory maybe stopped in a community, but it pops up somewhere else. So the question I have, and it's maybe in the clue of the system, they give planning permission, they give pollution consent, they give discharge consent. The clue's in the name. Maybe the system is actually designed never to stop anything. And maybe the system itself is the problem, because we have been sucked into this idea that the system here can regulate stuff. Now, I know we don't have an environmental court, we don't have an independent environmental protection agency, all that stuff. Even if we did, they're still operating within the paradigm of the conventional system, which treats nature and people as property. Whereas chainsaws have legal rights, directors of mining companies have legal personhood to go to courts, but the freshwater pearl mussel in the Oldkillie River doesn't have any precise legal rights. It can be defended and they can't go to court. So it's just led me to think about a few observations. I think in terms of Nicaragua, I think that support, even though if it's only emotional, Monica, it just enriches us so much to know that, there's the same story happening elsewhere, albeit in a much more stark way. Tomorrow, I know the Friends of the Earth are in court in London to try and stop a gas project in Mozambique. We get defeated in the first round in the court system, the High Court, so we'll be there tomorrow, and that's an £850 million gas project. And we don't need that type of project anymore. It's going to destroy local communities. So that type of support as well, I think, is absolutely vital. I think there's something as well about, and we saw this in the narrative around the climate bill, oh, we're so brilliant here, our environmental management regime and the way we look after our food production is so clever that if we have a climate act, it's going to transfer these problems elsewhere. What it fails to recognize, for example, is that 10,000 hectares or so of Cerrado in South America or Amazonian rainforest has been destroyed every year. Indigenous people are being displaced. Thousands of tons of soy are being shipped into Belfast port every week. Thousands of tons every week to feed caged animals, the protein sent across the world, and the effluent stays behind to destroy our river systems, which are turned into sewers. Our Great Lakes here, like Loch Ness, is it's called eutrophic, in other words, full of phosphates and full of nitrates. Air pollution is at a record high. All our protected sites are exceeding the level at which damage occurs because of ammonia. But the real problem, I think, that we never calculate is what's happening elsewhere. So we have a duty to look much more closely into these global supply chains and not kid ourselves, that we're a paragon of virtue in this country. Just a few other quick ideas as well, and I know I'm running out of time already. I think what's really important for us in terms of environmental defenders is that there are some within the system. There are whistleblowers, and they need a lot of our support as well. One thing that is really sad here is how to get experts to support environmental defenders. Not a day goes by when we need a tree person, we need an aquatic biologist, an economist. It could be any discipline at all, and the system is very good at closing that down. Closing these experts down within universities, I have to say, but also generally speaking, not a day goes by when somebody says, "I can't work for you because I lose my income, I lose my job." That is a massive issue. And the two final points I would want to make as well is what we've seen over the last few years is the police system within Northern Ireland. Who does it work for when it comes to a conflict? It works for the system and it works for the corporates. I have lots of evidence of that this could be a talk in itself. But that's clearly a big issue that needs to be addressed. And of course, the corporates are moving in now. The border in Ireland is a vector for environmental crime, not just with mining concessions, but with other inappropriate developments. We still have the threat of fracking around Fermanagh and Lough Neagh, and they're using the same handbooks that they're using elsewhere. So I think what's happening across the world is going to happen here, and we need to be ready for it. Our problem is that we have lost our memory about what nature looks like because it's been degraded so much over the years. That's the bad news. Do you know what the good news, I think, is that groups are supporting each other. And to me, that's the biggest lesson over the last wee while, where communities in a peer-to-peer way are seeing one group struggle and everybody else's struggle. And to me, that's what's going to change. It's not going to change from the top. Even when we're in the European Commission, they were incredibly lax in terms of applying environmental law here. We had complaints and threats of infraction gone in for the last 10 years. Very, very little was happening. And I would just want to salute the groups, that have been holding the government to account and actually holding each other together as well, because I think as part of this process, it's the grassroots, it's the energy from the local level. And we saw it within the anti-fracking campaigns. We see it in groups like the Gather and emerging out of Zero Waste Northwest. We're seeing it, what Fidelma is going to describe, I would imagine, very soon in the Spurns, and also developing networks such as, the Communities Against the Injustice of Mining, where this collaborative energy and intelligence and resistance is being brought to bear. So just hands up, take a bow. These amazing groups are just really changing the landscape here, and that's how we will win in the future. We will not win by relying on environmental law, the Planning Appeals Commission, or a ministerial decision. We will win by relying on each other. If I can, and I know I don't have a lot of time, I just want to mention just an idea that's emerging out of here at the minute as well. Of course, this is about Indigenous wisdom, and it's the idea that nature should have rights as well. And to me, my epiphany, light bulb moment for me was that this is not about nature. This is also about people, because the basic idea is that, and at its most simplest sense, is that the earth is a living being, and rather than seeing the earth as a dead object the way environmental law does, because it treats the earth as an object, it treats rivers as an object, we should see the earth as a living being. And of course, this is what Indigenous people across the world have known, and we can share some of those stories with us, and I'm delighted that some of them have been over educating us about what it means to be human in this planet at the minute. And I think if there's one thing that we need to do, is that we need to teach our children that the earth is a living being. But of course, really our children are teaching us now. So like, I can see this in the words of Michael D. Higgins. There was a tree that was cut down recently in Enniskerry in County Wexford, and the response from the kids in the class when they looked out of the window was, I don't know if anybody saw that, was just visceral. It was a cry from the heart. They're killing our tree. The buzzard that nested there every year was their friend. It was their relative. So there is a shift in language here, and there's a shift in how we perceive our relationship with the earth. I think in terms of this stuff, the first step is really the most important one, and also the realization that, you know, we've created these systems and we've created these laws, and if we've created them, we can quite easily redesign them to meet the imperatives of ecological and planetary boundaries. So in terms of what the rights of nature are, to me, again, to re-emphasize, they are indisputably the rights of communities. You know, this emerged as a democratic movement in India and Bangladesh, New Zealand, in South America. And nature really has to have a right to exist, a right to flourish, a right to evolve, a right to regenerate, and particularly in a country like ours that has suffered so much ecological devastation, it also has a right to be restored. So they're just some of the thoughts really coming from where I am at the minute. There's so much work to be done. It's such a pleasure and an honor to learn from other countries, you know, and what you've taught us from Nicaragua and South America and First Nation people is that we're not objectors anymore. You know, our language has to shift. We're defenders and we're protectors, and we can't operate within the current system. The current system is designed to give everything permission. We have to think of new ways and new ways of thinking, and thankfully that's coming from the deepest places within the hearts of Native communities across the world. So thank you for listening to me, and thanks for giving me these this opportunity for some general observations. So.
Thank you so much, James. I don't know if you heard, but you did get a round of applause there at the end there. So I'm actually just going to hand over to Fidelma now, who is from Save Our Sperrins.
Hello, everybody.
James, sorry, could you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, James. Well, James is stopping sharing his screen and I get mine. Are you okay, James? Sir?
I am useless with things. I'll just stop sharing now. Okay, let me see what I press.
Maybe I just say hello to Monica, and it's an honour to be involved in this along with people like yourself. I was shocked at the scale of the licensing, the permits or the concessions, the mining concessions in your country. We think it's bad here that 25% of the north has been given out in mining licenses, and 28% of the south has been given out in mining licenses, and that's far too much as it is. So just only to just compare notes. Okay, can everybody see my slides?
Yes,
so,
we can.
Go back. Sorry. Okay, I'm from Save Our Sperrins, and our campaign is to protect our water, our air, our land and our health from the toxic pollution of gold mining. And a Canadian company called Dalradian Gold set up here and applied for planning permission for a gold mine and processing plant in the Sperrins area of outstanding natural beauty. And you can see from the photograph that we are indeed an area of outstanding natural beauty, and this is what we want to protect. It's not for ourselves, but it's for our children, our grandchildren and future generations. We set up the campaign in June 2015 and have been learning since and continue to learn every day. So because this was called environmental human rights, I started to look at it, and it's something we've been just only recently gathering information about the human rights transgressions and crimes that are happening here. And as Monica mentioned, Global Witness, and they say that mining is the deadliest industry for those who choose to oppose it. And as she pointed out, the number of environmental protectors who have been killed and murdered and over the past years because they were trying to protect their land and their water and their air. I suppose what we had heard in the past were stories from the global south about people being murdered, women being raped, and people being assaulted because of their opposition to mining and the extractive industries. And I suppose it's only recently that we're realising that it's happening here in the global north as well. So our opposition to Dalridian's mining plans have met with a corporate and policing response that threatens several human rights in the United Kingdom's Human Rights Act 1998 and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the articles we have identified so far are the right to life, the right to respect for private and family life, freedom of thought, conscience and religion, freedom of assembly and association, freedom of opinion and expression. And just there in October 2021, the United Nations adopted the right to live in a safe, clean, healthy and sustainable environment. And I think that, you know, that applies so much to what we're doing at the moment. So I had just started to look at, oh, what happened there? Okay, started to look at these. I don't know what's happening. My thing's jumping a wee bit. Okay, so I started to catalogue these crimes against the protectors. As James said, we've decided, you know, we were being called protesters and lots of other names that were negative, and we decided that we would start calling ourselves protectors and defenders to be positive about what we're doing. So over the last few years, a number of things have happened, and we began to realise that there's a pattern here. And reading a book by Carlos Zorillo, we realised that this is all, these are strategies used by mining companies throughout the world. So in 2029, death threats, 2019, death threats were delivered to 3 of the protectors by the police, who said that there were viable or credible death threats, and they believed it was because of the protectors being in opposition to the gold mine. Then there were murder bids, and these were carried out by using vehicles driven by employees of the gold mining company. So I have already sort of listed a few, and this is work in progress, but one protector was hit by a tractor driven by a Dalridian subcontractor, and that protector was photographing oil pollution that had been caused by Dalridian. Another protector was hit by the wing mirror of a van driven by a Dalridian employee. Another protector on foot was hit and thrown over the bonnet of a car driven by a Dalridian employee. That protector was taken to hospital with cuts, bruises and shock. Furthermore, another a protector who was standing on the road was driven at and hit on the leg by a Dalridian employee. And that driver left the scene of the accident. Now, I personally videoed that incident because I happened to be there, and I was absolutely shocked. I couldn't believe, I thought the man was going to be killed. Then moving on to physical assaults, one protester was repeatedly punched by the brother of a Dalridian employee in the local shop, and this was captured on the shop's CCTV. A protector was wrestled to the ground by Dalridian staff at the gates of the Dalridian compound. He was taken to hospital in a neck brace, and at the same incident, his phone was broken by the Dalridian staff. So sex calls and threatening phone calls. Again, at the moment I have 4 recorded, 2 sex calls to one protector and a threatening phone call to a protector that his children would be put in bin bags, and a threatening phone call to another protector threatening him, you know, that his life was in danger. So then we've had people followed at night in very suspicious and threatening manner, and I've had reports from 3 females and 1 male. The male has reported the incident, but the females haven't reported the incident to the police. And then we've had lots of cyberbullying over the last 4 years, and in fact 2 files with copies of all the posts have been given into the police. So this is work in progress at the moment, you know, the sort of human rights abuses that are happening here. And I know the pale insignificance compared to what Monica has told us. I would like to mention, sorry, where am I at now? The next one. Okay, so moving on, that's one side of it, the crimes that are happening against us. Carlos Cirillo, the man whose booklet we read, he talked about it being a strategy of mining companies to criminalise protectors. And so we have all of those previous incidents have been reported to the police, and quite a lot of them we've had video evidence because we've got help from the frontline defenders who have given us a grant to buy dash cams and body cameras. So we've been, you know, trying to be proactive in recording things and being on the ball, you know, and getting the evidence. Now that has all been handed into the police, but the police have said no crimes have been committed, and they say, and to date, no prosecution of Dalridian employees have taken place. On the other hand, we have harassment of protectors by police. One example, a car sitting with full lights on at a protector's house at night, and he lives in a housing estate, and his neighbours were questioning him why was a police car sitting out shining the lights into his house. A protector was singled out for special protection at a road checkpoint. He was held for 45 minutes, and again everybody looking at him and wondering why was he being detained. The police have been taking photographs of us whenever we do protests, and they come right up in our faces, walk along in front of us and take our photographs, and we feel it's probably their right to do that, but you know, it's really a form of harassment and intimidation. They also have been phoning protectors at night, and I mean, for example, I've got one of the calls, and it's more or less telling us if we speak to a Dalridian employee. I had seen 3 people acting suspiciously at the river, and I asked them who they were and what they were doing, and it turned out they were Dalridian employees, and they refused to tell me what they were doing. But I had the police phoning me to say if I did that again, I could be charged with harassment. And you know, it's absolute, and it's not just me, the same line is being used to a lot of protectors. So again, it's like intimidation or harassment. And then charges being brought against protectors, and they're all very petty charges. For example, aggravated, you know, trespass. I'm just trying to see where I had a few notes on it. The aggravated trespass really was, I mean, one man who chained himself in, I think it was March 2021, to the gates of Dalridian's compound, because at that stage they had no planning permission. They still don't have planning permission. At that stage their prospecting licence had lapsed, so they had no prospecting licence, and they should not have been there. And he was charged with aggravated trespass, even though he caused no damage. His case has been up to court 14 times since last summer, and in fact, sorry, the 14th time will be the 22nd of March this year. And we feel that these charges are tying us up, our time and our money, because we have to pay, you know, solicitors and barristers to represent us. The other charges are like harassment of Dalridian employees. That's if we speak to a Dalridian employee. There was one man up in court for wagging his finger aggressively at a Dalridian employee. Damaging Dalridian property. there was a man charged with cutting 2 cable ties that probably cost maybe 20 pence. And, you know, again, that was thrown out of court. Another protector was charged with blocking the road, and he wasn't blocking the road. The photographs clearly showed he wasn't blocking the road, but the police insisted that he was blocking the road. Another charge of resisting arrest, and because he asked why he was being arrested, I mean, apparently resisting arrest is a very easy one that you can be caught on. If you even wave your arms, you're resisting arrest. Again, the police calling at protectors' homes late on Friday evenings. They've done that to 8 protectors' homes, offering them cautions for having staged a sit-in at the local council offices 2 years previously. None of the 8 people accepted the caution, so now they're being taken to court. And on the other hand, these are all like what's happening to us. On the other hand, if there's any incident at Dalradian's premises, the police respond immediately. 2 or 3 carloads of police are there within 15 minutes. It seems as if Dalradian have the police on speed dial. They can come so quickly. And yet, I mean, the day that I witnessed the man being hit by the car and phoned the police, it took 1 hour for the police to come. So the other thing that we have learnt is the police have a special silver command set up to look after Dalradian. And that ties in with what we've seen in other countries where the police are supporting the company. And in September 2021, the police announced that from now on they will be providing free security to mining companies. And this will cost millions of pounds to the public purse, and especially at a time of huge pressures on our health service and our education service, etc. And so this is really shocking that the police are now going to provide free security to mining companies for the future. And in fact, refunding charges that had been paid by a mining company. Oh, this is my last slide. And basically, I suppose, on the one hand, you can say a lot of things are happening against us, but it has really made us more determined to fight this battle. And the resolve of the protectors is very strong. We take heart from global struggles against gold mining throughout the world. We have gained solidarity and strength from campaign groups and that we have made links with, especially over the past 2 years through the pandemic. We have been involved in a lot of Zoom links, Zoom meetings, and it has given us heart and strength to continue our battle. We are determined to win this battle for clean air and clean water, for the sake of our children, our grandchildren and future generations. And the message we send out loud and clear is Ireland says no to mining, and our motto is one person can make a difference and everyone should try, and that's from John F. Kennedy. And we always use that photograph of one of our supporters going over to the Dalradian compound with his big placard, and that's, you know, and we do believe that if we all work together we will overcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fidelma, for sharing that. So our last speaker this evening is Jeannie McCann from Trócaire. So we would like to welcome Jeannie up now. Fidelma, can you stop sharing your screen?
I'm just trying to do that here.
That's good.
Viara.
Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be with you all today. So just before I start, I'll just show.
I think that's okay.
Okay, hello everyone, my name is Jeannie McCann. I'm the Campaigns and Advocacy Officer with Trócaire. Monica, thank you so much for being here with us, and it's so heartbreaking to hear the stories that you've shared with us of the grave human rights and environmental damage that's been caused in Nicaragua. And also to James and Fidelma, fantastic to hear about the local aspect of these issues as well. So some of you may know TROCRA and some of you may not know who we are. We're a social justice and human rights organisation, and we work in more than 20 countries around the world through local partners, so local people who understand the local context and how to respond. And TROCRA has worked in solidarity with communities in Nicaragua for the last 40 years as well, often through very turbulent times. And so we work to tackle the root causes of poverty and not only hand out and treat its symptoms. And so across the world, as we've already heard from Monica, we're hearing that human rights are under attack, that people are being oppressed, discriminated against, silenced and even killed, and that democracy is under threat. People are often excluded from decisions that affect them. And so it's in this case that we're very concerned about the widespread reports of corporate human rights abuses and environmental abuses in communities where we work. Often we find that these abuses are happening at the end of supply chains or investments which start in this part of the world. And the vast majority of people here, as I'm sure you would know, are deeply uncomfortable with the idea that the products that we buy, either garments or gadgets, might be contributing to climate change and exploitation in other parts of the world. And so in response, we're calling for stronger regulation to hold companies to account for these violations. And so as Monica has already reminded us, the 21st century is dominated by large transnational corporations. They operate across borders and are often wealthier and more powerful than the states that are competing to host them. Communities that seek to protect their human rights from the actions of these corporations face growing threats of violence and intimidation. Indigenous communities, as we've heard, are rarely consulted about large-scale development projects such as mining, logging and agribusiness, such as palm oil and sugarcane plantations. And our partners have reported violent evictions of people from their land, pollution of land, the destruction of the environment, the loss of livelihoods, and deepening poverty. And women and Indigenous communities are impacted most. And as we've also heard, those who question and peacefully resist the destruction of their lands and communities face brutal consequences. States and corporations often combine to suppress peaceful opposition to large-scale developments, and so killings, attacks, criminalisation and repression of defenders are all on the rise. And we've already heard tonight about the Global Witness stat that in 2020, 4 people every week were murdered for defending their land and human rights. And women activists, especially Indigenous women, experience threats of sexual violence and smear campaigns. And so there's a number of really high-profile cases. We've already heard, oh, that was supposed to be Berta, but she's not there. Berta Cáceres, who was a Honduran human rights defender. She was the co-founder of TROCRA's partner COPEIN, and I know that Friends of the Earth have also supported COPEIN. Berta was an internationally renowned activist. She won awards for her work defending human rights abuses, the environment and Indigenous people, but that did not protect her from the harassment and attacks. And almost 6 years ago to the day, she was shot dead in her home for leading her community's opposition to a hydroelectric dam. This photograph's taken in her community. This is Maria, one of the elders in Rio Blanco in Honduras. And the project had received millions of dollars of funding from the Dutch bank FMO and from the Finnish Fund for Industrial Cooperation. And both funders pulled out after Berta was murdered, but it's too late, because the key is that the violence and intimidation had happened for years before Berta was murdered, and they knew about it. So the response was too late. And Berta's family and community have continued to defend their land and to campaign to bring the masterminds behind their mother's murder to justice. The dam project is now frozen, but the licence has not been revoked, and so they fear that it will be started again if funding is secured. But crucially for the family, a little bit of hope, as I've been speaking about earlier in Central America, is that during the summer, David Castillo, who was the CEO of DESA, the Honduran company that was building the mine, was found guilty in a Honduran court for being an intellectual author of Berta's murder. So this is hugely significant for all people who have campaigned for justice for Berta and all who campaigned for the issues that she supported. And the family view it as being hugely welcome and significant, but they do stress that it's clear that there are other intellectual authors who remain at large and who may not even be in Honduras as well. But of course, as we've already heard, this is not an exception. So here we have Bangladesh, the Rama Plaza factory in 2013, a 5-story factory that collapsed and almost 1,000 people died, mostly women. There hadn't been adequate safety inspections done in the building, and Western companies like H&M and Primark had sourced clothes from the factory. Then we have Shell in Nigeria. So Shell have operated in the Niger Delta since the 1950s. 11 million barrels of oil has been spilt in the Niger Delta, which has caused huge environmental destruction and huge impacts on people's lives and livelihoods. The average life expectancy in that region is 10 years less than anywhere else in Nigeria. And the WHO estimates that the water is 900 times above adequate safety levels. Then we move to Colombia and the infamous Cerrejón mine, which has for years there have been well-documented environmental and human rights abuses associated with it. So a mining giant called Glencore owns the mine and it's listed on the London Stock Exchange. And over decades, Ireland's state-owned electricity supply board, the ESB, imported millions of tonnes of coal from the mine. Indigenous communities next to the mine have suffered chronic poor health, contaminated water. They've faced fear and intimidation when they've tried to oppose the multi-billion-dollar mining industry. And there's been 35 Indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities evicted from their land, often using tear gas and armed guards. And then lastly, the last example is Tullow Oil in Kenya. Again, it's an Irish company that's now listed on the London Stock Exchange. And in Turkana, where Troca's worked for decades, it's an arid region, frequent droughts exacerbated by climate change, and Indigenous communities rely on the land for their life and for their livelihoods. And it's contested whether the community have given their free, prior and informed consent, which is their right to the extraction of oil in the region. And so this woman told my colleague that the road to the oil field runs through her community's communal land, and every day she sees trucks leaving the land and going towards the coast, taking the oil out of the community. And she says the community doesn't benefit and she wonders who does. And so it's clear that there needs to be a serious conversation about addressing the role of corporations in our world. And just 100 companies, including the largest oil, coal and gas companies, are responsible for 70% of all global carbon emissions to date. So it's clear that we can't address the climate crisis without also addressing the issue of corporate accountability. And as we transition to a decarbonised economy over the coming decades, there's going to be a growing demand for minerals to build electric vehicles and land for carbon offsetting projects. And so we're likely to see more violations of people's rights. And so as we know then that this is a systemic global problem and therefore it requires a systemic global solution. Communities in the developing world cannot access justice in their own country, nor in the country where the corporation is headquartered, most likely Europe or North America. And also, human rights are not about consumer choice. So therefore, we need legislation to protect people and the planet and to hold companies to account if it's found that they have not. There's been an over-reliance on voluntary measures for states and businesses alike to tackle human rights abuses and the environmental harms. And it's clear that these voluntary approaches have failed, and so now it's time for legally binding measures. And so Troca, along with a number of other organisations across the world and social movements across the world, it's very much been led by the Global South, are calling for new legislation in the UK and Ireland, but also at an EU and UN level to hold companies to account and to ensure that it's not a tick box exercise, that they are held to account if they're found that they conduct human rights or environmental abuses in their supply chains. So what would this law look like? So these are some of the key issues that we would call for it to be covered. So crucial that it would cover all businesses, that it would protect people on the planet and recognise human rights and environmental standards. Key issues around accountability and ensuring companies are liable if they cause harm. Also about delivering effective remedy and access to justice for victims of violations in other parts of the world. And so just then to finish up on, I just wanted also to highlight, this is an image from Guatemala, and I showed this to someone last week and they thought it was quite a recent image because they're wearing face masks, but it's not. That's how our world's changed, is they're wearing face masks because the police are using tear gas. And this is a community opposing a tin mine in Guatemala. And so what the pandemic has done is highlighted that the structural failures that exist in our economic, political and social systems, and these failures have created a global crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, food insecurity, conflict, displacement and deepening inequality. These crises are a result of political choices over decades, along with unregulated corporate power, and they're undermining human rights and the protection of the environment. And so now it's time to stand together with the Indigenous communities who are trying to protect their rivers, their land and their forests from pollution, because they're already protecting all of us by defending the natural resources that we all rely on. And so just to finish off, I wanted to finish with this quote from Bertita Caceres, who's the daughter of Berta and who is now the chair of COPEEN, the organisation that Berta founded. And she said, the situation in Honduras is not unique. This type of crime can be seen repeatedly across several Latin American countries and in other regions of the world. Therefore, as Lenca people, we support and demand that there should be greater regulation of European companies, banks and investments to avoid the repetition of abuses like what happened to my mother. European companies must apply the same human rights standards that are applied in Europe when they operate in countries such as Honduras, where the lives of those who defend their territories are seriously threatened. And then the very last slide is back to Berta. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Jeannie. We're actually going to now just flip over. So Jeannie and Monica are going to come sit here at the front. Fidelma and James, could you turn on your cameras again? And then, so we're going to have a bit of a discussion. So I'm just going to swap microphones 1 wee second. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much to Monica, to Jeannie and to James and Fidelma for speaking to us this evening. Does anyone have any questions for any of the 4 speakers? Yep, so you're just going to have to speak into the microphone so that people online can also hear what you're saying, okay?
Hi, is that working? Can you hear me, everybody? Yeah, looks great. Monica, if I could ask you, in terms of it was interesting seeing James's presentation after yours, and kind of you see Northern Ireland and the environmental degradation, and then Nicaragua obviously has a better kind of intellectual or ecological integrity. So I'm just wondering, it seems to me sometimes Europe is the places where all these corporations are, and we sold our kind of ecological integrity for the kind of consumer goods and how well off we are as compared to places like Nicaragua. And I'm wondering, what level of opposition, I suppose, are within communities? Sorry, it's maybe 2 parts. Within communities, would there be brothers against brothers in terms of people, as they would say, for the jobs that the canals or the mines bring, And if you could flesh that out, and then also in terms of like alternative ideas of development for your country, if not these projects that are maybe a false kind of panacea, what kind of more ecologically non-European approaches do you see towards development and improving people's lives that wouldn't result in these mega projects and things like that and destruction?
Okay. No, thank you very much for the question and also for your own reflection, because you were sharing basically your reflection on how ecological deterioration globalizing, because that's what happened. Nicaragua, it's facing like a huge environmental challenges, not for 200 years ago, but just like the last decades, it has increased, and the voracity of the interest in this kind of goods, it's worldwide, growing in a way that all the examples you gave are important. We have, in the case of Nicaragua, when the canal concession was being discussed, and also with the mining concessions, there's always this way of portraying these projects that sell the idea that the project is solving the poverty issues. And it's completely reasonable that a part of the population thinking about the possibility of solving the lack of jobs and the poverty conditions, to have the desire at some point to engage in these projects. But the reality is that when you see the development of mining worldwide, it's not, you don't need to think about your local community. It's already proven worldwide, and that's why I gave the number of the peak of exports of gold in Nicaragua. That doesn't mean that there's job for Nicaraguan people. Less than 1% of the population, it's actually working around mining concessions, but the impact on water resources, it's massive. So if luckily now it's not an issue of wondering if the mining concessions could be a solution for the development of the country. It's worldwide proven that it's not only a solution for the development of the country, but the human cost and the environmental cost, it's quite evident. So fortunately, we have more evidence now than maybe in other moments of history when people were facing this. And with the canal concession was the same. When they presented the project, they were talking about 1 million Nicaraguan people working along the mega projects. So in a 6 million people country, that's like, wow, like that's the dream, right? 1 million out of the blue because of the money of this private Chinese investor, which nobody knew exactly who was backing up the finance of all of this, will solve the problem. And then when the company started talking about the project, it was not about 1 million workers. Like the numbers were when the real investors started talking about it, not the politicians, but the investor. In the end, they were talking about bringing 60% of the workers from China to Nicaragua to work in Nicaragua in the mega project, as usually happens with Chinese investment worldwide. So basically, they were talking about displacing 119,000 Nicaraguan people for having less than 20,000 Nicaraguan people supposedly working. So what is the result of employing 20,000 but displacing 119,000 people from their livelihoods because they produce food in the lands? And this is very important. The indigenous communities and also the campesinos communities produce their own food. They are self-sustainable in that way. So they would have to migrate to a city with no formal education to find what kind of job in the city. So it was, for us, the estimation was easy to do. And in the end, the population also joined to the struggle against the canal concession. And just finally, I think that I agree with the reflections that are being made in terms of every place in the world, these conflicts are arising. In some with extreme violence, like my country. But that doesn't mean that what Fidelma was telling, you should be really worried. And this is my message to you. In Nicaragua, for many years, we were facing exactly what Fidelma was saying towards human rights activists and environmental defenders. And I personally never thought that I was going to see this kind of massive shooting of people in the streets. And it starts, the violence, it starts this way, with harassing people, with death threats. And at the beginning, the population doesn't think we are generally affected because this is just Fidelma's group being affected. But then when the conflicts start growing, really putting at risk some interest, then this could be a different thing. And I think it's relevant because also the refugee crisis in Europe and what's happening, that we never take out of the table the possibility that things we consider an achievement and an achievement of democratic societies can go backwards. And I think it's very important to be alert and to make these signals of oppression and repression through citizens protesting as very bad signs, and just to be aware that things with time could get worse, and hopefully it doesn't happen to you what happens in other parts, that the conflict reach a level where just violence was completely wide open, like what I expressed. So this is just to say that it's not about comparing the size of the violence. It's just being aware that these tools are being used at different scales, but with the same purpose, which is not allowing the population and the citizens decide the future of their territories, and just simply imposing the project. So that's, I think, one of the reflections I wanted in a reply to what you were saying.
So thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Yep.
Thank you for really interesting speeches. Just in terms of rights of nature, I guess. So recently, I read briefly that Colombia is thinking of treating some of its land that has been devastated due to like the decades of conflict as a victim of the conflict, and therefore kind of a subject of transitional justice, if you like. So I was really interested in it, but a bit confused as to what transitional justice would look like for nature, and also in terms of what James was saying about the destruction of Ireland, basically, in all its natural beauty. How would transitional justice look for nature?
James, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. Before I try and answer that, can I just pick up something that Monica said, and following on from Fidelma? Like, it's really interesting about this low-level intimidation that's going on here. I'll not mention the group, but someone said to me recently, my house has just been damaged by a lorry from a developer. My kids are being intimidated at school. This guy also said his wife was beaten up and stuff like that. Have you ever heard of this intimidation happening before? And unfortunately, I had to answer by saying I haven't known a group in Northern Ireland that hasn't suffered from intimidation. Now, it's low level at the minute, so your words, Monica, are very sobering to me about how this can escalate very quickly, and also the impact of paramilitaries as well in terms of land deals and development, and obviously there's self-censoring going on all the time, within communities. In terms of the rights of nature, this is a really difficult concept, and I really appreciate that, but it's more a shift in perception, I think, at this stage, in terms of how we view ourselves as one species. not having dominion over the earth and every other species. I think that's a really important shift. I think what has to happen here is it has to move into the legal space. You know, and I'm really encouraged by cases across the world at the minute where, for example, in Florida, there's a case going on at the minute where the plaintiff in that case is actually a wetland ecosystem trying to protect itself from a massive development. Interestingly, the developer is from Dublin. They call themselves a boutique equity firm, you know, but the person taking the case is actually not a person. It's legal personhood afforded to a habitat. And we're seeing that with sort of some First Nations struggles in the States where like a species of wild rice has been afforded legal protection. I can see it in relation to, say, the river foyle system in Northern Ireland, you know, where there's massive transboundary conflicts there over pollution and over development pressures where, you know, that could be, you know, a really interesting case. Imagine if we afforded legal rights to that habitat to actually take a case on behalf of the habitat itself and obviously the communities. It never strikes me as like amazing that, you know, when the last remnants of ancient woodland here are cut down by a chainsaw, the chainsaw has more legal rights than the ancient woodland, that the directors of the companies who are carrying out illegal quarrying operations here all over the place, particularly along the border, have got legal personhood in court, whereas the habitat or the community's rights don't have any legal protection. So I think it's opening up a really important conversation about what has standing in the courts, and also is there a way to reverse this decline outside the current legal paradigm. So I'm really keen on trying to investigate opportunities where we shift the jurisprudence or the legal basis of our law to encompass other species and other communities we share the planet with. Like there's about 20 cases at the minute across the world in relation to climate litigation, and basically they're all saying the same thing, that the real plaintiff in the case is the earth itself and its rights to survive, and the atmosphere's rights to survive, and people's rights to breathe clean air are not to be subject to climate catastrophe. So there's a growing shift in this direction. It's very early days, you know, but I think we can at least reflect on the good things that are happening in Bangladesh and New Zealand and Ecuador and Bolivia and learn from this. It's by no means a silver bullet, you know. None of this stuff is. It's not easy. And the last thing we need to do is give false hope, you know, but I think there is hope in the idea that we're part of one earth, and that it's not that we just belong to it, but we are the earth as well. And that shift into that legal space, I think, is probably the most dynamic grassroots environmental movement that's happening across the world. It's not without its problems, and I have to emphasize, it isn't a silver bullet, but one thing, you know, like there was 2 or 3 different events in Donegal and one in Derry this morning, you know, where communities were really trying to assert this idea that the rights of communities and the rights of nature are now indivisible, and the current system doesn't work to protect them.
Thank you, James. Does anyone else want to come in on that, or does anyone have any other questions? Yep.
So I just have a question for Monica about the role of international solidarity and how you view that in Nicaragua.
Feel free to share also your own, it's not only questions, you can just share your thoughts. So it's important for me, at least, it's very important to hear what you are thinking about these issues and bring that back, because it's not only about sharing what we are living, but also understanding it. I appreciate very much the presentations because it gives me an idea on where is the discussion at the moment here. So please feel free just to share your thoughts. It doesn't have to be questions about Nicaragua only. So, and the other thing is in terms of I can relate a lot with this reflection on rights of nature. I personally study environmental law, and when I was studying environmental law, I had all the time I had this question: is it really all of this complexity, legal complexity, really useful in a way? Like, is it really there to help us have better tools to achieve the goal of having sustainable communities, of protecting nature? And I do think there is an important process, as James was mentioning, in terms of reflecting. There is really even a change in different constitutions of different countries, and of course, most of the questions are not solved. Like the one you made a question, like how would you litigate a case on behalf? But just the fact that we are asking that question, that already gives me some hope that we are open to thinking beyond what has been our understanding of what law is for. And I'm a lawyer also, and so all the time I'm reflecting, really, we have built up many of the things we have built up. Maybe that they made some sense at some point, but at the moment there are so many things that don't make sense anymore because of the level of humanitarian crisis, refugee crisis, environmental crisis, climate. Like when you see all of the big picture, I don't see that. Also, the movement around it, it's global. So when I'm talking about Nicaragua, as I mean, I'm not expecting that the solidarity expresses particularly on the Nicaraguan case, but when I talk about Nicaraguan refugees, my reflection is what you can do for the refugees that are near you, not for the Nicaraguan people in Costa Rica. Or when we talk about mining concessions, that maybe in some cases could join efforts because some of the companies are based in the UK. But if they are not based in the UK and they are based in Canada, what can you do for the process of mining concessions as the ones that were presented here? So I think that's the kind of solidarity that needs to be built. And also I do think it's the international human rights movement and environmental movement, and along with women's movement, have become stronger and stronger, and that's where we have to get our hopes. I think there is a strong force emerging to change things. We don't know really where this is leading, but at least I prefer to be closer to the feeling of we are working towards change than we are being defeated by all the problems. So I expect more the solidarity in the part of you already being here. It's a show of solidarity in terms of you got interested in the situation of a country so far away from you. But at the same time, what I want to know is what are you reflecting on your own engagement and or your own discussions, and including academia, because academia is also a place of struggle for this thing. It's not far away. So that's, I would mostly like to hear from you, like, what are you thinking? Yeah.
Thank you, Monica. Would anyone like to share anything, or does anyone?
And I love very much the expression, the beautiful trouble, now that I...
Monica learned a lot about Northern Irish history in the last 2 days, so... Does anyone have anything they would like to share? Or does anyone have any questions? Yep.
Thank you. Hi. I wanted to ask, actually, I wanted to pick up on what you said about sort of different constitutional traditions, and I wanted to actually focus this question on increased tendencies towards legalizing and talking about things like the rights of nature and so on. And I wanted to focus this question on what you thought enforcement might be. what is a remedy? Because my experience that sort of straddles academia and legal practice is we try thinking a lot outside of the box, but you then come up against what is possible. And if you only try and go into court and litigate, you're not even doing half the job. You're doing less than a tenth of the job. What you actually need is written branch legal reform. So I'm very interested in the idea, but also in terms of legal reform, we tend to be stuck very much in the traditions that we are all in. And speaking as both an academic and a practicing lawyer, I know definitely we love to be little islands. We don't really talk to one another across different traditions. So I'm very interested in the idea of what we can learn from constitutional traditions such as yours, and where we can sort of cross these divides and try to learn from each other. And so what can we do? What do you envisage to be a sort of remedy or enforcement that could complement having rights for nature? Because just having rights isn't doing anything,
Thanks. Yep. James or Fidelma, would you like to speak on it? No.
Just very quickly, I think I would probably say that
for some time I thought that my profession could be like having the better tools for defending whatever value you believe in, right? Was like the most important thing. But then along my experience in the reality of my country, and I cannot speak of your reality and how useful some of these tools are because I don't know, but in Nicaragua situation as I've described, I'm convinced that really even the constitutional changes, legal changes, jurisprudence, all of this, the only way of really achieving or at least not achieving the desired goal, but walking towards that goal, because of course we cannot in one single case achieve maybe whatever you're looking for in a broader picture, but it really relies on I know it could sound cliche, but on the power of the people, really. When we exercise all the legal, we exhausted every legal tool in Nicaragua against the canal concession. Everything you can imagine, a law proposal signed by thousands of people. We have an open case in the Inter-American Human Rights Commission. I personally presented complaints, inconstitutionality complaints, amparo resources, everything you thought. And in the end, the only thing that really managed to put a break, because I cannot say it's over, it's just a break, because until the law still exists, it's possible they use it, was the organizing of the people in the communities. So the most important legal work I engaged with was going to the campesinos communities and explaining the impact of the law in their life. And I think that's part of the reflection we have to do. How our knowledge from the legal system and the implications of a law, it's really translated into a tool for the people to exercise their own rights, because it is not up to us as legal advisors to exercise the rights of the others. It's when they realize that they have rights and that they are affected, it's when people start mobilizing. And I think the union of that effort, the legal tools, of course, have as you reflected on yourself, but the most important thing in any of these things is the organizing part. And that's a lot of small everyday work that is usually requires like the biggest commitment, because we see in the media when a case reaches accord, but all the work that has to be done to get to that point or to get to the international media, no, I think that's really the thing that can change, and that's what happened, I think, with climate activism and with women's rights, in fact, and so that's what I could say. Like, how do we engage in the organizing of the movements that really give the strength to the appeal, and then the legal tool can have the result that we are looking for. But just on its own, like, you would have to really trust and rely the judiciary system. In Nicaragua's case, we don't have access to justice really in Nicaragua. So it's basically relying on the force of the social movements. And so organizing that and being part of that process and engaging from your capacities, joining efforts with other people who have other capacities is the most relevant thing, I think, to see some impact. That's what I could say.
Thanks, Monica. Yep.
Okay, thank everyone for their presentation. It was really impressive. It's just a bit more about sharing my thoughts based on Monica's and also James' presentations. I think one way to bring the idea of transitional justice to the fore, especially integrating that process with a kind of a green viewpoint, will be something. I'm not a lawyer, but one idea to do that will be kind of holding a people's tribunal, given that the official justice process is something it doesn't really serve people in nature. But where there is already a movement, global movement for international rights of nature tribunal, which has been held in Chile, and it was held in Glasgow last year. So there is a bit of a movement, emerging movement for that, and we can tap into that movement because it's a global movement. So yeah, that's just my idea to share.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to share?
How you doing? Yeah, for myself, thanks for the presentations. I found them really interesting. My own career has been in the world of recycling, so I immediately think about the demand for these materials, and yeah, I kind of think, I've always thought, we live in this bubble of consumption and we don't think about what happens and leads that stuff to us, and then what happens once it leaves in our bins to end up wherever it ends up. So yes, I know that there is a huge movement in Europe to concentrate on this concept of circular economy, to keep materials close in circulation. It clearly needs to be much faster. But what really makes me, the question I'm really left with, again, it's a question about demand for these materials, is where we're faced with the terrible question of climate change, and where there is this massive movement to move towards electric vehicles, which requires lithium and other raw materials to be mined in ways which we never mined before in terms of quantity. And it makes me question, the politicians' promise, which is that we can transition to zero carbon and still maintain the lives, standard of living that we come on expect in the West. And it makes you kind of go away from the thinking, and at what cost?
Getting all tangled up here, 1 second. Would anyone like to speak on that specifically?
So, I mean, issues around the just transition and some of the things that I was speaking about are really clear around just what you said around, like, firstly, the rush to decarbonise will probably go to the private sector. And if that happens, then we find lots of examples of the Aguasarca hydroelectric dam, for example, in Honduras, the Berta Cáceres case, where the private sector will trample on people's human rights to build their mega projects. And so having clear human rights and environmental obligations tied to those projects is going to be vital. And then secondly, around the carbon offsetting projects and the electric vehicle minerals, yes, there's going to be issues that again arise to human rights and environmental issues as well. And so all of this speaks to, you know, obviously the example of the and what's promised or not is not promised is that we can't ever take the foot off the pedal, and never, it's like eyes wide open all the time as to what is being promised and what's being delivered and how it's being delivered. And that's the role of civil society and strong social movements, that there's no silver bullet to any of this, and we need to keep being vigilant and pushing for the highest proper standards throughout. But yeah, I mean, yeah, but what you said is completely right. Yeah.
James or Fidelma, would you like to come in on that as well?
Over to you, Fidelma. That's a really important question, isn't it? You know, because that really brings home to us about what type of future do we want, you know, and do we want to keep on the treadmill of a growth economy, or do we want to reconfigure who we are, what it means to be human, what it means to live within planetary boundaries, and how we want to connect with community again? You know, like, we can't mine our way out of the climate crisis. We've been saying that for such a long time now. The greenwashing out there is just never stops. They will have us believe that any type of destructive activity is important for a new green economy, and of course it isn't. So I think the question that's been raised is just the fundamental question, like, how do we live with each other? How do we work with the growth economy? How do we work towards degrowth? And what is it that we mean when we talk about sustainable futures? Like, there is, for example, in Wales, a future generations bill. You know, maybe we should think about that in Northern Ireland, but actually give it real teeth, and talk about our culture as well as our politics and our economy. But yeah, they're going to justify anything, aren't they? You know, on the basis of this green growth plan. You know, in Northern Ireland we had something called Growing for Growth, which over the last 12 years has, strangely enough, the only strategy that was ever implemented in full. Not only implemented in full, but they exceeded their targets, and that was to do with replacing family farms with industrialized agriculture. And we see the consequences today. They can do that with anything, and I think this is where the strength of social movements and conversations and debates like this are absolutely vital, because no, we can't continue the way we are just by putting a greenwash on everything. We need to seriously reconsider what it means to have an economy, and an economy that serves our needs, not one that we serve. And fundamentally, that's the bigger question, the bigger picture. So I think within communities that I'm talking to at the minute, and I think Fidelma could come in on this as well if she wanted to, is that when these pressures of these mega corporations coming in, it forces you to think about what type of community you want in the future, what type of economy you want. And I'm so glad what Monica said. You know, it's just what I wanted to say as well, that this is coming from the grassroots. The legal architecture will change, you know, like we have, for example, in the South, a Citizens Assembly coming up on biodiversity. And I know biodiversity sounds like a washing powder or whatever, you know, but that did lead to massive change, you know, in terms of the other two Citizens Assemblies, one in relation to equal marriage and the other in relation to reproduction rights for women. So, you know, we could see something dramatic coming out of this Citizens Assembly down south, because when you get ordinary people, terrible term, into a room, selected at random, over a period of 3 months where they listen to so-called experts. Something shifts in the zeitgeist, you know, something shifts within these ideas. And for a conservative country like Ireland to embrace equal marriage very quickly, it was due to that community power. And also the fact, I think, that the citizens' assembly process in the South is embedded within legally the decision-making process of the Irish government. So, like, I do have massive faith at the minute because I see things shifting on a daily basis. I see people getting concerned and deconstructing their mindsets about what they were given by their parents or their education system or by the churches or whatever it may have come from, into sort of reimagining what it is to be human now. So anyway, that's all I want to say.
Just will I say something? James putting me under pressure. No, I just no. I suppose I would agree with some of the points you made, James. Definitely, going for growth has been the policy here, and I mean growth is finite. Once our resources are taken out of the ground, they're gone forever, and we are left with damage in perpetuity. So, according to Earthworks, there's enough gold in the bank vaults of the world to meet any needs for the next three or 400 years. So I think during that time, they've got to come up with something else, you know. Well, and I mean, I like the idea of the circular economy. Dalradian, the Canadian gold mining company that's here, they're really portraying themselves, you know, as a green mine because they're contributing to I think it's a water purification scheme in Cambodia, and they think that that absolves them from removing the hundreds of acres of peatland here. They've applied for a water abstraction license to abstract 500,000 gallons of water every day from the surrounding peatland of their site for every day of every year for 20 years. So that, I mean, peatland that is supposed to be a very good carbon store, the most effective carbon store. I mean, it's so contradictory. You know, on the one hand, they're portraying themselves as, you know, green. And the other thing, they've applied to use 3.3 million litres of diesel per year for 20 years. And again, you know, no worry about the fumes from that and what it'll do to their pollution. So it's, I think it's very hypocritical, you know, and the stuff that's out there, all the greenwashing. I just, you know, I think, as James said, we do need to rethink our, you know, gross, whatever it is, domestic product or whatever, you know, that, like, say New Zealand and Sweden, they're talking about making health and well-being the priority, not getting bigger and bigger all the time, and greed is really at the foundation of that. Whereas if we focused on health and well-being of people, wouldn't that, you know, make a much better place to live? Just a few thoughts.
Thanks, Fidelma and James. So we're going to wrap it up there. We're just going to show a really short video. But before we do, I would like to ask you to extend a massive thank you to Monica, to Jeannie, to James and to Fidelma for all that they have shared this evening. It has been really interesting to learn about what's happening both in Nicaragua, in Northern Ireland and across the globe. So just